We modified our Virtual Boy using Vertex Virtual Tap for RGB out. I was grateful to be able to experience this game on a CRT using original hardware, as well as change the color to yellow for a very Wario time. Enjoy! Virtual Boy Wario Land is a platformer and is the second game in the Wario Land series. The story goes that Wario went on a small island vacation by plane and, while lounging, saw some creatures carrying treasure out near a waterfall and went over to investigate. After he saw their treasure stash, he tried to steal it but ended up falling down into a trap into a cavern below. Wario now has to take a self-locking elevator back out of this cavern, with each section of his journey represented by its own unique stage. The goal of each level is simple. You have to find a key to the elevator shaft so that you can go up to the next area. It sounds like a piece of cake, but the level design is different from other platformers of the day since it's very non-linear. There are tons of places to check out, like doors, pipes, and portals that can lead to a new single room or a whole new area with even more paths to wind down. Exploration is a huge part of this adventure, and not only is finding the elevator key at stake, but there are plenty of other treasures and bonus items hidden in each stage to collect that add to your overall plundered wealth. Virtual Boy Wario Land gives you a false sense of security by starting out on the easier side, but very quickly ramps up with maze-like level layouts and tougher enemies. Some unskippable minigames or puzzles are also here, like launching well-timed smaller watermelons into the background area to hit a switch that explodes a giant, happily sleeping watermelon in your path. Yes, this sort of gimmicky stuff that attempts to take full advantage of the depth effects from having a foreground and a background to work with. This was a reimagining of one of two post-level bonus games from Super Mario Land 3, but instead of being optional, these things are now mandatory obstacles to overcome within a stage. I found that these diversions slowed the flow of the game down to a crawl, but there were also great level design elements that really focused on the background areas and added something novel to the gameplay. You could almost always see goodies far off in the distance, but the question was always, how do I get there? Sometimes it was through a jump board, which can propel you back and forth between the two, but other times you could only get back there by taking a door or passage in a different room. Wario's sprite was a bit hard to see back there sometimes, but it was a really clever way to get more mileage out of the levels. It seemed like a lot of care went into stage design to make each area and the rooms within it feel like one logical and continuous place, like this one level where you walk from room to room through a house, for example. This was carried over from the first game, where paths branching off of the main stretch had clear dead ends, so you knew when to turn around. In Virtual Boy Wario Land, though, sometimes I take a door and seemingly teleport to somewhere else entirely, and this made me feel lost a lot. I didn't feel like the first game was significantly simpler in terms of its layouts or anything, but they were much more direct, and I liked that better than some of the randomness in the sequel. I initially scoffed at having 20 minutes to complete each stage, but as the game went on, there were a few times where I was down to the wire to make it out alive. Some of it was due to the disconnectedness of the levels that I mentioned, but a few areas weren't always straightforward to get through. Once in a while, the backgrounds would get really busy and obscure a new pathway to try in the foreground, and it would take a while to even be able to see it. That was far from the worst of it, though. There was one level in particular with a waterfall that seemed to require some tricky platforming to ascend. I thought for sure I needed to be Eagle or King Dragon Wario to fly across, mixed with some fancy platforming off of the enemies there. I spent a ton of time trying to find the power-up hats that I needed, but kept losing them. After what felt like an eternity, I figured out that I could swim up the waterfall and that the platforming was just for suckers like me. They put an underwater section at the bottom of the waterfall, so if they wanted you to swim up that area, why not just continue the water section up to the top instead? The waterfalls in the first game were not swimmable either, and this change felt totally out of nowhere. I encountered this pretty far into the game, so it left me wondering how many other things I could have potentially interacted with that I thought might have just been a part of the background. Although I didn't feel like I got the most that I could have out of the 3D depth effects sometimes, the graphics in Virtual Boy Wario Land were sharp and defined, especially considering that they were restricted to working with only one color. The stages truly came alive in their details, and even something like the little end-level beaver watching his TV had tons of personality. Being able to play it on a larger CRT to see all of the touches that went into everything surpassed the experience of playing it through the visor for me. My favorite part about the visuals was how emotive the enemies were. They really built upon the basic style of the pirates from Super Mario Land 3 that looked like they belonged to the Sonic universe, for no good reason. The level with the waterfall that I mentioned earlier had this one enemy type called a Dark Tortoise that had the most evil smile when he'd be winding up to throw his spiky hat at me. Their malevolence made me laugh even though they gave me a ton of trouble. Lots of enemies were really well designed, not only in the visual sense, but also in how hard they were to strategize against. Many of them had multiple stances or forms to impale you with that made figuring them out more involved than just instinctively jumping on them. If I'm being completely honest, I had trouble fighting, and I feel like some of that is because the controls were hard to get used to. I've played enough platforming games that feel fast-paced and reactionary, whereas the Wario games feel a lot slower in comparison. In the original Game Boy game, there was no ability to run unless you had certain power-ups, and even though they added running to the Virtual Boy game, they make you use the shoulder buttons on the back of the controller instead of the B button. The B button here is assigned to special abilities that Wario gains when he's wearing one of his hats, like flying or shooting fire, and this was a difficult change for me. In keeping with the conventions used in so many other successful games that came both before and after Virtual Boy Wario Land, it would have made more sense to route run to B and have the special power be a shoulder button thing, or at least have chosen one of the many other buttons on the front to use instead. I understand that the Wario games give you the power that you need for specific obstacles built into the level, like fire blocks or distant platforms to fly to, but trying to keep straight which of the hats combine to make special powers, and of those which forms allow you to use barge or body slam felt impossible. They all sloshed around in my head and could never be parsed out in the heat of the moment when I needed them. This diagram from Super Mario Land 3's manual sums up this convolutedness nicely. I could never hang on to my hat for very long anyway, so it didn't matter very much, I guess. I'm sure this would have become easier to keep track of with a lot more practice, but even after playing the game from start to finish, I didn't feel like it ever really clicked. Because I died a lot, I didn't finish the game with any of the many treasures to uncover since you lose either one of them or half your coins every time you continue. There are some gambling mini-games between the stages to potentially increase your riches, and how much wealth you have at the end of the game determines which of several endings you get. Considering my total death count, I barely had more than a few coins to rub together at the end and definitely got the worst ending possible, which I won't spoil here. It was the boss fights that kept me down most of all. No two encounters were the same, and each put a different creative spin on using the foreground and background areas. This kept things fresh compared to the Bop the Boss 3 times formula that gets old so fast in other games. The final boss fight was a real difficulty spike that approached nightmare levels because of the accuracy it required. I couldn't quite get a handle on that for a long while, and I lost the majority of my treasures and money in the many attempts that it took to best that monster. I'm not sure if there was a trick or something I could have done differently to have had better luck with it, but it felt tough to the level of not being fun anymore after what felt like the 100th attempt. Virtual Boy Wario Land was more of all of the things that I enjoyed about Super Mario Land 3. It was an overall fun experience that was filled to the brim with challenge that stems not only from creative gameplay elements, but also from a clunky interface that I struggled with from the moment the game began. It's often said to be one of the best games on the Virtual Boy, and I can definitely agree with that sentiment, but it didn't feel like anything more than just another average platformer when compared to the other games that were out at the time.